Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, March 19th, and we will hear the presentation, The Road to AICP. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the chat box. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making this webcast possible and free to members. Today in particular, we are sponsored by APA's Women in Planning Division. So thanks to you for pulling this session together and hosting and being a part of our consortium. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. You can register for these and all of our webcasts by heading over to our webcast website at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits. You can log those by heading over to planning.org, logging into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which again can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Make sure you like us on Facebook, head over there and search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. That's where I post any important or timely information like a date or time change, or even when we have new webcasts available for you to register for. And we record all of our sessions. We post them on our YouTube channel. Again, just search Planning Webcast on YouTube and we'll pop up. Along with our over 300 recordings, we have over 3,000 subscribers, so make sure you join in on the fun and you'll get notified when new videos are posted to our channel. I think that's it for my housekeeping items. We'll also have a PDF of this presentation available at the conclusion on our webcast website, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And a final reminder, as you think of questions, type them in that chat box. We'll answer those at the end of the Q&A. And with that, I think I'm done with my housekeeping items. So I'm going to turn the controls over to Caitlin Wintz from the Women in Planning Division, who will kick things off for us. And Caitlin, I just sent those controls to you.
All right, awesome. Well, welcome everybody, and I'm happy that you all were able to join us on this Friday. This is the Road to AICP webinar hosted by the APA Women in Planning Division. My name is Caitlin Wintz. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Director of Programs for the APA Women in Planning Division. I currently serve as a senior planner for the City of Colorado Springs. And I also act as an area representative for APA Colorado. And today I am going to be introducing our panelists. So first we have Katrina Corcoran, AICP, pronouns she and her. Katrina graduated from the University of South Florida's Master in Urban and Regional Planning program in August of 2017. She worked as a planner with a consulting firm, Renaissance Planning in Tampa, until March 2019. In her current position as a senior planner with Plan Hillsborough, Katrina assists in transportation-related policies, strategic planning, implementation, and special area studies. She's very active in her local American Planning Association's Sun Coast section and became chair-elect in September 2020. She previously served as the Professional Development Officer from June 2017 to September 2020, and a student representative from August 2016 until May 2017. Katrina is passionate about professional development within planning and enjoys assisting others with the AICP process. Our next speaker is Acela Chavez. Her pronouns are she and her, and she is an AICP candidate. Acela was born in Mexico and is a recent graduate of the University of Washington, where she earned a master's in urban planning and an urban design certificate. She's based in Seattle area and currently works as an assistant planner and permit specialist for the city of Duvall, Washington. Prior to that, she worked as a planning and innovation intern at the Regional Transit Agency. Acela is a was awarded the APA Outstanding Student Award by her planning program and passed her AICP exam this past November. Outside of planning, Acela enjoys reading, playing video games, and listening to podcasts. Our next panelist is Molly Riddle. Pronouns are she and her. She's also an AICP candidate and a recent graduate from the Masters of Urban Planning from University of Washington. During her studies, Molly interned with the Seattle Department of Transportation's Development Review Team, served as the Sea Grant trainee, and conducted research for UW's Urban Infrastructure Lab and Institute for Hazard Mitigation Planning and Research. Molly previously studied international public health policy and biology at University of Pennsylvania and worked in marine medicine research, bicycle education outreach, and international active travel project management. Molly currently lives in Berkeley, California, enjoys cycling, scuba diving, and propagating plants. And lastly, we have Jonathan Pacheco-Bell. Some of you may know him as @CityPlanner, and his pronouns are he and him. And he is a practicing urban planner with over 20 years of experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, spanning fields of planning, architecture, library, and information sciences. He's the creator of Embedded Planning, a practice that situates the work of planners on the ground to advance equity, build authentic relationships, and increase public participation for historically marginalized communities through street-level engagement. After 14 years as an embedded planner in LA for local government and community-based organizations, he recently launched his City Planner Company, a workshop to produce new thought and action in his intersecting fields. In March 2021, Jonathan was appointed as the social media director for APA Los Angeles. He looks forward to partnering with all sections, divisions, chapters, and the national to tell the planning story. Jonathan holds an MA in urban planning from UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and an MLIS from SJSU iSchool and undergraduate degrees in political science and architecture. So those are our panelists who will be speaking today. And with that, we have some polling questions that we are going to ask our participants to answer today. So Christina, I will pass it back to you.
All right, wonderful. Let's get those polls going here. So our first poll, we just want to know about your gender. So if you could answer that, and if you prefer not to answer, just no need to answer. We'll give that a few seconds here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this one up, and we will share those results. So 67% female, 27% male, 6% non-binary. We're going to go ahead and run the next poll here. Here we go. If you are not comfortable answering, again, just please feel free not to answer. And if you are more than one race, I guess just pick a primary race, I suppose. There's just a question that came in. I'll give it another second here. I should have put multiple options. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this one and share these results. So it looks like 76% white, 12% Black or African American, 9% Asian. We stand by you, our Asian friends. This is a rough time for you. And American Indian or Alaska Native, 3%. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. We just have a couple more here to kind of get an idea of who we have here on the line. Next question is, how many years of planning experience do you have? Let us know. We'll give it a second here. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and close it and share our results. Student 15%, let's see, 0 to 5 years, 52%, that's our largest amount. 5 to 10 is 15%, 10 to 15 years, 7%, 15 plus years, 11%. So the majority of our folks on the line here are 0 to 5 years of experience. I'm gonna hide this one. And launch, we just want to know, are you AICP or are you an AICP candidate already? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close up shop here. Well, you guys are great at answering these. The percentage of people that vote, this is great. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close it and share the results. 84%, nope. And 16%, yes, they're either AICP or a candidate. Okay, I'm gonna hide this one. And our last question is how interested, so obviously this is for the folks that are not AICP or an AICP candidate. How interested are you in becoming AICP? Where are you at? I'll give it another second here. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close it up and share those results. 72% extremely interested, 26% moderately, and 2% not really interested. So that's it for our polling questions. Now we kind of have a good understanding of who we have on the line, and I'm going to turn the controls back in just a second, as soon as I can get my screen to do what I want it to do, and you can get started. Okay, the screen is back to you.
All right, great. So let's move on, if I can. Okay. I might have just clicked too many. Okay, we'll go with this. Okay, so I think in order to have an informed conversation about AICP, what it is really how it started. So this is a very quick overview of AICP and essentially how the American Planning Association, which is the association that created the AICP certification, how it came to be. So in 1909, we have the first planning conference that was hosted in Washington, D.C. This was a very informal discussion of a group of interested academics who were interested in more of a national conversation about planning, and that happened in the United States. And then about 8 years later, in 1917, we have the American Institute of Planners that is formalized. This group, the American Institute of Planners, or AIP, is essentially the group of academics. They're interested in policy and are more the practitioners. Then in 1938, the American Society of Planning Officials is created, and that is a little bit unlike AIP in that this association mostly consisted of a planner coalition including planning commissioners, city administrators, public officials, people who may not be formally trained in planning but still do that work in the day-to-day. And these two associations existed sort of alongside each other for many years until 1978, when the American Planning Association is born. So 1978 is a pretty big year for planning professionals overall. We have the merging of AIP and ASPO to create the American Planning Association, and at that same time the AICP is created. And this was created as a way to preserve or continue to promote the educational work that the folks who were members of AIP, the work that they were committed to, which was continuing education and planning practice education for current planners. And then the AICP sort of evolves over time, and in 1998, the creation of the College of Fellows is established, and that is for planners who have the AICP certification and who have had some distinguished contributions to the profession. So what we see in AICP membership today and APA membership today. So obviously 2020 was a unique year for all of us. There have been noticeable reductions in many folks' ability to participate in professional organizations, as evidenced by the reduction in overall membership and in AICP membership year over year from 2020 to 2021. But what we do see is with just a little over 38,000 APA members and 16,900 AICP certified members. That's about 44% of the overall APA membership are AICP certified planners. So just for some context for you all today about different folks and what they do, and if they choose to obtain AICP certification, those are the numbers that we're seeing in APA today in 2021. And with that, I will pass it to Katrina to talk about certification.
Hi everyone, my name is Katrina. I actually took the AICP exam back in November 2019, so relatively a recent exam taker, and I've also been the professional development officer for my local section. I was that for about 3 years. I'm now the chair-elect, but I still have a passion for helping folks with the AICP. So to start off today, we wanted to talk about the benefits of certification. So there are many pros to taking the AICP. And that includes that the credential is, for better or for worse, an industry standard at this point. It is expected within the planning field that you get the AICP certification. And going into that, the certification is also preferred or highly regarded in most planning organizations. So whether or not you're going for a private or public position, you will often see in job applications that AICP preferred or AICP candidate preferred. So if you get the certification, it can help your resume stand out in a stack of applications in a highly competitive job market. Additionally, one of the setbacks, which we'll get to for the AICP, is that it can be very expensive. However, many organizations offer support, including payment of dues, and some organizations will also agree to pay or reimburse you for the exam. So that's something to take into consideration. If it's covered, you're essentially subsidized and you don't have to worry about the cost. Additionally, getting the AICP keeps you involved with APA and also allows you to continue your education through certification maintenance education credits. So you'll get that great networking along with APA, as well as keeping up with trends and new topics in planning just by being certified. And finally, the big one, you can also have the potential for a salary increase. If you get the AICP designation, you can use that as leverage for promotion or for a raise. And overall, I don't know the exact stat, but I believe that APA says that AICP certified planners overall, not the, sometimes there are exceptions, but overall earn more than those who do not earn the certification. So next slide, please. So there are many reasons to take the exam and obviously many positive aspects of being certified. However, as the next speaker will dive into, a test doesn't define you as a planner or person. So some of the best planners that I know have had to take this exam more than once, or they're just not certified for one reason or another. Maybe they just don't want to take the exam. Maybe they've had a hard time passing with the format of the exam. Some people aren't the best test takers. So if you do take the exam, if you have to take it more than once, or you figure out that it's just not for you, it doesn't define you as a planner or person. You can still be a great person at your job. So we're here to give you both sides of that. And with that, I will pass it over to our next speaker.
Hi, everybody. Jonathan here. Thank you all for joining us. It's good to be with you. I want to begin by saying that I come in peace. This is not an attack or a takedown of AICP. It's called counterpoints to stress that this is part of a larger conversation. a dialogue, a flow of ideas about our profession and about our credentialing system. I think we must acknowledge that not all planners have or even want AICP. We must keep an open mind about how our colleagues pursue their own professional development. This supports inclusivity in our workspaces, and it also supports critical reflection about our own practice. So with that, I'm going to be offering 5 counterpoints to this optional credential. Next, please. The first is that AICP is too expensive. My colleague's going to cover a little bit more in the cost breakdown in a few slides, so I'm just going to summarize it for our audience here. The traditional AICP cost is as follows: $70 for the exam application, between $220 and $290 for the essay fees, depending on if it's expedited or not, $220 for the exam registration. So right now we're at about $550 to take the exam. And it's about the same cost for the new AICP candidate pathway. But everybody needs to remember something. You also have to be a current member of APA to take the exam, and membership comes with cost. So we're going to use my membership with APA as an example. I paid $310 for the national and $124 for the California chapter and the Los Angeles section. So we're looking at, for me, $434 for membership, not including my optional divisions and the fact that I opted into the journal subscription. So in total, it would cost me about $985 to pursue AICP this year. We have to ask ourselves if this is an expense worth incurring. And we also have to consider that in these very tense times marked by, rising housing costs and precarious employment. Next, please. Second counterpoint is that AICP is not needed. And here's what I mean by that. Let's start with some data. Assuming that a majority of planners in the US belong to APA and are eligible to take the exam or moving in a direction of eligibility, here's what we had in 2019. About 36%, a little over 1/3 of the planners held AICP. And we learned from Caitlin today, 2021, we're at about 44% of planners holding AICP in the United States. So if you break that down, the vast majority of planners are doing this work without this expensive optional credential. Right now, we're looking at about 60% of our field not having AICP. So just take a moment. Among your colleagues, think about all the folks you work with. Think about the folks you work with that don't have this optional credential. I think that you're going to envision in your mind some damn good planners out there. This credential can be helpful, but it is not needed for you to be an effective planner. It's not needed for you to excel at your job. I say what is actually needed for planners is empathy, an ability to listen and to speak and write in plain language, and an ability to connect with people on the ground in their community spaces. You don't need a credential or a license to do that. Personally, I've opted to invest my energy into these transferable skills instead of certification. Next slide, please. AICP is also self-fulfilling. The planning enterprise that we are in created this credential and then said we needed it. We're told we need it by the same discipline that envisioned it and created it. We're told we need it by our leadership, many of whom have it, so it's a bit self-serving. We're told we need it by the same organization that administers the credential. We're told we need it by the same organization that benefits from the fees collected and that gains any cachet from having each additional new member. I think we have to recognize the circular reasoning here. The planning field decided it was important, they tell us it's important, and we start to perceive it as important and required because it exists. So we end up pursuing AICP, thus affirming the original assumption of its importance. I say, my fellow planners, let's challenge assumptions, let's break the self-fulfilling logic, and let's consider other ways to grow and to develop as planners. Next, please. In practice, AICP also serves as a gatekeeper credential. Now for this, I'm going to tell you a story. I worked for many years in the zoning enforcement section at LA County Department of Regional Planning. Beautiful thing about LA County is that we have planners doing enforcement. So planners are out on the ground with the primary duty of implementing and enforcing the code, but they also do some more traditional planning work. So one of my zoning enforcement colleagues a couple years back submitted their required planning experience essays for this exam and got back a response from the APA evaluators that said this: what you do is important as a municipal service, but it is not planning. So you're not eligible for AICP. Well, this colleague and everyone else in zoning enforcement for that matter knew more about the communities that we serve than anybody at the public counter, because we were actually on the ground implementing planning and zoning law and building connections with folks out there in the field in the community. But that experience was rejected. Now, the next cycle, you know what my colleague did? My colleague simply submitted the exact same planning essays and swapped out the term enforcement, replaced it with the term implementation, and was able to clear the screening, pass the test, and earn AICP. And they continue to hold that this day. So here's the lesson here. The admissions process itself hinges on particular words to make exclusionary judgments and deem a planner's work other than, not planning. The gate was slammed shut. By simply substituting in jargony planning terms, by maneuvering for optics, only then was this planner let in. This exam itself then functions as a way to limit access to a purported elite rank in planning. And as planners, I think we should be working to dismantle restrictive and exclusive spaces, not encouraging them. Next slide, please. Finally, AICP seeks parity with licensure. Now, as planners, we work with a lot of allied practitioners in fields that mandate licensure by the state. Think architects designing buildings, engineers designing infrastructure, landscape architects designing parks and open spaces, and attorneys practicing law that has people's lives in the balance. In all these cases, the state grants these practitioners the legal authority to practice safely in their field through that mechanism of licensure. Well, for us planners, there's not the same regulatory framework for our practice nationwide, with the caveat for New Jersey, the one state that licenses planners. So here's what I've seen in our planning realm. Many of our colleagues want parity. They want parity with these allied fields, and they kind of covet the exclusivity of licensure. Licensure elevates status. Our work as planners is crucially important in strengthening communities and uplifting people. We don't need a license to know how to do that. We don't need to compare ourselves to others to appreciate our work. Instead, we can save some money, maybe invest it in necessities or other forms of personal growth, hone our people skills, practice improving our communications, read on our own to stay atop planning trends and news, and support more inclusive practices in our work as planners. Thank you for considering my counterpoints. I'm going to pass the mic now to my colleague.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that, those great points. And I'm back again, this is Katrina again, to talk about the eligibility and process for the AICP application. So if you consider the benefits and the counterpoints and you decide that you're going to go ahead and move forward with the AICP application, for the traditional route of AICP, you would first make sure to bring your membership up to date. And you would review eligibility requirements for the AICP application. And again, you want to make sure that you're a current member of APA. You cannot apply unless you are a member of APA. Make sure that you are engaged in professional planning, either currently or in the past as defined by AICP, and have completed at the time of the application submission a combination of education and years of professional planning experience. So there are different breakdowns of the amount of experience you need based on your education. So typically, if you have a master's degree in planning or a related field from an accredited program, it is 2 years, but that can differ. And if anyone has questions, we can save that for the Q&A portion. One thing that I have had a lot of questions about over the years is that, let's say, for example, you're applying in December, and you will have completed all of your AICP needed experience for 2 years by January, and you'll be taking the exam in May. Is that okay? Unfortunately, it's not. You need to have your experience at the time of application. So that portion of that bullet is very important. And if you look at the graphic to the right, AICP, they have recently changed the process. So you can apply for AICP certification doing the things I just mentioned, and you can take the exam and become AICP without doing, or you can take the exam and then do your planning experience essays. Or you can do the more traditional route and apply, submit your planning experience essays, and take the certification exam. So that's up to you, whatever is easiest for you. It gives you more options. Next slide, please. So for the AICP candidate program, if you're interested in that, you can enroll in the program by submitting your education verification and paying the application fee. At this point, you can also begin tracking certification maintenance credits, which is the learning, continuing education that APA requires. You can register for the AICP exam, and you take that exam prior to earning professional planning experience. So this is really good if you're coming out of school and you have all that knowledge and you just want to use it for the exam and then get your professional experience later. But one item of note is that you must be in an accredited planning program to enroll in this program. Then after you pass the exam, you can earn your planning experience and finally submit your planning experience essays. Next slide, please. So as Jonathan mentioned, the AICP is expensive. There's no way around that. The traditional AICP exam costs, it's a $70 application. It's $220 for the essays or $290 for the expedited, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And it is $220 for the exam registration. So it is pretty expensive. Again, if you work for an organization that can cover this, that's something to consider before you decide to go into this process. There's also a $100 essay appeal. So if you get your essays rejected, you can appeal it for another $100. There is also a $100 transfer fee. So if you register for the exam and then decide, I'm not ready, I need to move this, you have to pay $100. However, in my experience as PDO, I have found that if you have a medical issue or a death in your family, please know that you can contact APA about that and you do not need to pay $100. A lot of times they can go ahead and move that exam for you without having you pay if you have some kind of extenuating circumstance. For the AICP candidate program, it is also pretty expensive. However, the expense is pushed out further. So the initial investment is a little bit cheaper than the traditional AICP exam. So you pay $35 for enrollment, $100 for exam registration. And then after you've passed the exam, done your work experience, typically 2 years, submitted your planning work essays and been approved, you're now AICP, but you pay the $375 or $445 for expedited essay fees at that point. I think the assumption is that you're further into your career at that point, a little more established. Again, you would want to check with your employer if they would cover these fees for you. Post-exam, you have AICP dues in addition to AICP APA membership. Again, many organizations may pay for these. And finally, you have certification maintenance. So these are the credits for continuing education. Many of them are free. Some are for cost, but traditionally I've found that you can earn all of the credits you need for free. So next slide, please. So finally, we have the essays, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. If you have more questions, again, happy to answer that in the Q&A portion. Typically, I could spend an hour and a half just talking about these essays. So the first criteria is to demonstrate a professional level of responsibility and resourcefulness while applying a planning process appropriate to the project or situation. The second is evaluating multiple impacts to a community when implementing professional planning tasks. And the third is influencing public decision-making in the public interest. So some quick general tips about these. Early bird, early bird, early bird. They're actually calling it expedited review now, but in my mind, it's still early bird. So you pay a little bit more money to be able to submit your essays at a certain time. You can get feedback from APA on whether or not your essays meet the criteria. That means that you're able to revise your essays and still, if you're taking the exam after submitting the essays, still take the exam in that cycle. If you wait and do the regular review and they reject your essays for any reason, you are then pushed out to the next cycle, which is a little bit inconvenient. Then you have to wait either another 6 months to take the exam, or if you've done the other option and already taken the exam, you cannot call yourself AICP until those essays are approved. The next tip is to review the AICP essay guide in its entirety. It's linked there, and I'm sure we'll be able to send this out to you guys. It's a little bit long, but it really goes into detail about each of these essays and can help break down how you should frame these. Next, review sample essays others have submitted. So that's a great way to frame your own response, see what others have done, and craft your own work into these essay responses. Make sure that your responses are between 250 and 500 words. Always speak in the first person, so use the word I throughout the response. Even if you are working on a team, don't speak to what the team did or we. It's all about what you are doing as a planner. And finally, have your local professional development officer or another AICP certified planner review your essays. This is always good just for grammar, getting another set of eyes on your essays, but your local PDO or another planner that's been through the process may be able to give you tips and tricks related to when they submitted their essays. So that's it for me. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I'll be passing it over to the next speaker for now.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Acela, and I will talk to you about the test specifics that we have. So there are 2 testing windows, May and November, and the testing time is 4 hours, but the actual exam is 3 hours and 30 minutes. The exam consists of 170 questions where only 150 count. 20 of these questions are being user tested, so you will know which ones are these. So you will have to answer all of the questions as if they were real. And the exam has 5 subject areas. This graphic shows the percentage of questions that correspond to each area. And you can see that the exam actually has questions that are kind of factual or situational in its content. The exam tests basically facts and scenarios on the process and documents that we planners produce, the different planning areas or specializations within the profession, which is areas of practice. We also have fundamental knowledge like history, theory, and legal cases. We also have rules of ethics and professional conduct. And we lastly have leadership, management, and administration. The topics or the emphasis of the topics changes over time. So we can have like different, we might have questions depending on like where are we right now. The content of the exam can feel overwhelming. So how can you best prepare for it? Next slide, please. Here are some tips that we found have worked for us and that we have heard that some people have recommended before. So our main advice will be to remember that the goal is to pass the exam, not to ace it. So you don't have to overstudy what you already know. So you can say you have to study a mile wide and an inch deep. You have to be very strategic in choosing your resources and make a plan. There is a myriad of resources out there, all of free or paid. It can be overwhelming. So you really need to know yourself and be strategic about this. So some of the options that you have are to join or make a study group, read a few core textbooks. You don't have to like, again, you don't have to like know every single thing to like and understand it like so far. Like you just need to be aware of what is out there. You want to focus on emerging issues. Again, topics change every year in terms of like what is current. So you might want to be aware of that. You might use cards to keep details fresh. You have your study cards and you bring them everywhere. And you take lots of practice exams. At the end, like, this is a test. So you want to prepare your mind and your body to a process of being there, sitting down 4 hours, answering questions one after the other. So you want to practice. This is the only way that you will find you are improving. Yeah, at the end, it's all a test. So with that, I'm going to pass it to the next speaker, who's going to give you more tips on that.
Thank you, Acela. So just picking up from there, with regard to actually taking the test, we have a few tips for how to translate your preparation into actual success on exam day. And these relate both to content as well as the structure of the exam. So first, regarding content, the key to remember is that this exam, for better or worse, it is written by the APA and it is ministered to planners from around the country. So when answering questions, always apply or adhere to APA policy recommendations and ethical standards, and think like an average planner. So in many ways, this is more of kind of a township plan exam, or one suited to how you would operate in any jurisdiction across the United States than what you actually might be doing in a very nuanced and specialized role in a major metropolitan area. So you want to keep that in mind when you're preparing, but also when it comes to that exam day and you're actually answering the final questions. Think APA, think national average practice. Regarding the structure of the exam, in addition to, of course, going in prepared, rested, etc., and having practiced using the software that you'll be using, either if you're going to a place in person or if you're using a remote exam interface, just make sure that you understand, how to navigate your way through the exam using marking and scratch pad options. Aside from that, though, when thinking about the structure of the exam, we learned 2 really helpful tips actually from the New York Metro chapter, APA chapter. First, use the test to take the test. So over the course of the 170 questions you'll run into, you might encounter 1 or 2 that are particularly tricky, or more in all likelihood. When you get to that point, keep in mind, mark the question, think about it, answer it if you can. There's no penalty for having a wrong answer, and then keep moving, because it's quite likely, if this question relates to a fundamental aspect of planning or something that has been recently emphasized, you may well encounter that material in a slightly different form in a later question. And actually the structure of that later question might either give you the answer or help you kind of jog your memory and shed some light on how to answer the earlier questions. So appreciate that fact. You can move back and forth throughout the exam, use the test to take the test. Lastly, just reiterating again, there's no incorrect answer there's no penalty for an incorrect answer aside from simply not getting the points. And there are 20 questions that don't count toward your score. So keep moving, mark your questions. You should have enough time to go back through and really answer everything. Your goal is to pass, which requires approximately answering about 73% of the questions that count of the entire set. So focus on that. May I have the next slide, please? Regarding how to kind of put actual resources into action, as Acela said, there are a million resources, and in many ways in preparing both ourselves when we took this exam in the fall and in discussing this with friends who are preparing for a spring exam, one of the hardest parts of studying is knowing where to start and how to actually limit the scope of what you aim to tackle, because there's so much information out there. So this is just a brief run through of a few resources we appreciated. That is APA, of course, going to the source, starting with APA resources, looking at a few core texts, appreciating third-party study tools that can supplement your work, and then considering whether or not to take an exam prep class. There we have a whole bunch of discrete links and actual references for these for these resources that you'll see in subsequent slides. But speaking to these one by one, again, this is an APA exam, go to the source, and APA resources are mostly free. So speaking directly to kind of APA-wide publications, you have Of course, the AICP exam guidelines, as well as a manual that you can actually purchase through your chapter for about $18. Aside from that, we suggest reading all of the APA policy guides. They are short and very direct indicators of what APA policy recommendations are. You can also read through the PAS quick notes, the kind of short, pithy summaries of the content from PAS reports. And you can read through those very easily and get a good sense of what's going on kind of across the board in planning. We also recommend reading Planning Magazine if you don't already, because that's a really good way to kind of check in on what some either hot topics or kind of recently emphasized areas of planning might be. Regarding APA chapter resources, your local chapter, as well as others, have archived as well as live content relating to the exam. This includes study materials, webinars, study groups this season of the exam you're taking. So we highly recommend you reach out to your professional development officer and learn what options there are for you to engage with that content right now. Actually, on that note, we want to thank the Florida chapter. Henry Bittiger, the state professional development officer there, has actually offered to provide all of that chapter's AICP exam resources to those of you who are in this webinar today. We have the details for how to access that in a subsequent slide, but that's immensely helpful and really kind of them to do. Regarding these last 3 points, first, we have given a list of about 5 textbooks, which we think are immensely helpful and provide a nice summary, cohesive summary of a couple things. One, the ethical standards as well as scenarios you're likely to encounter on the exam. 2, kind of the general history and theory presented in a nice cohesive package so you can think about themes that will come up in both scenario and factual questions, as well as textbooks that address more kind of planning practice standards. That last section of textbook is really useful for, say, the interdisciplinary elements of the areas of practice. So covering everything from transportation to climate change and environmental planning, community engagement. Lastly, I'll say with third-party study tools, there are a lot of resources out there to supplement the textbooks and the APA materials. You can find videos, you can find flashcards for free online. They're really helpful, so find something in the medium that works for you. Just note that if you're going to be using flashcards to memorize content, there's a lot out there from either previous iterations of the exam or just developed by people who maybe didn't fact check what they were posting. So, you know, the first run through, just confirm the facts and then use those liberally. Regarding classes, of course, there's this big question of whether or not you have to take a class in order to really understand what's going to be on the exam. Disclosure, Acela and I did take a class, but it's certainly not necessary. So just considering, there are generally 2 main options we're aware of, kind of chapter-based classes, which you can access through your local APA chapter or perhaps another one, as well as a planetizen course, which is actually more expensive, coming in around $275. The benefit of taking a class, as you might imagine, is that you get curated content specific to the most recent iteration of the exam. You also get either people to tap for questions or access to forums where you can post tricky subject matter. And you also get lots of practice exams and practice questions. So you can both test your understanding of the material as well as your familiarity with how to move through the exam and what types of answer solutions you're given. The cons, of course, are that it's more of an investment, right? You're putting more money into this certification, and we've already talked about how much money is going into it in the first place. Additionally, if you're taking a class that's asynchronous, i.e. you aren't meeting in person or even remotely via video, you still have to really manage your time and set your own study plan for how you're going to digest that material and then kind of keep it fresh in your mind. So at the end of the day, taking a class doesn't supplant having to do any of the other work or using the other resources, the APA guidance, the textbooks, etc. But it can really help kind of give you the comfort that you know what you're covering is going to address all the content on the exam. But at the end of the day, it really depends upon the time and resources you have, and of course your own background, how recently you were in school or what you covered when you completed your education. So again, subsequent slides are going to go through the detailed resources that fit into these different categories. So I will actually hand it over to Caitlin to take us through those and then move on to questions.
Excellent, thank you, Molly. So there are some additional resources that were put together for this program, some emphasized exam topics that we'll see on this slide here. I'll just kind of roll through these. I don't have a whole lot of information really to speak on in relation to these. I just want to make sure that the attendees today have a chance to look at them and read through some of the information here. This PDF will be available not only with Ohio Planning Webcast, but they'll also be available on the APA Women in Planning website, which is women.planning.org. And Christine, if you could write that in the chat for the attendees, that would be greatly appreciated. So here are some additional exam study resources. And as was mentioned with some of the other presenters today, be sure to coordinate with your professional development officers individually at your state chapters. If you're a student, continuing to work with some of your faculty who may have the AICP certification is also extremely useful. So those people, the PDOs for each of your state chapters, they're there to help you and give you some guidance. And so this is the amazing resource that Molly had mentioned with Henry Bittaker, who is at APA Florida. He hosts an amazing exam prep. And this is his contact information below. If and when you're ready to take the exam, this is his information to take his prep course. And so with that, I'll close out sort of the presentation portion of today's webinar, and we'll move into Q&A. So I guess I'll stop sharing my screen and we can all turn our webcams back on, panelists. So if any of the attendees today have any questions, start writing them in the chat, and we're here to answer the questions you have.
Yep. So we're getting a lot of questions, and some of them I know you covered, but folks are still asking. I tried to go in and answer some of these questions that were kind of specific, providing a lot of links, things like that. So let's go ahead and get started here. This is a good question. I don't really know if there's an answer to it from this group, but so I understand this is an industry standard, but I've noticed most transportation planners I'm working with don't have AICP. Is getting AICP more important or different for different sectors, in your opinion?
I'll go ahead and start with that one. So I am a transportation planner, and a lot of the transportation planners that I work with, I'm in Florida, Tampa, Florida, do have the certification. So maybe that's a regional thing, or maybe related to a particular type of planning that you're doing within transportation. I have found that many transportation planners do want the certification. I believe at one time they were offering a transportation specific certification, but I'm not sure if that's still the case. Again, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, there are counterpoints to getting the certification. So if there's something else that you'd rather pursue, that's also a totally valid option. I know that there are different levels of certification, different types, so maybe there's something else that you would rather pursue. I'll let some of my fellow speakers weigh in as well.
Katrina, you answered the question perfectly. You know, it does change sector to sector in the planning profession, and so it may be a regional or local thing if or if not a certain type of planner would hold that certification.
Okay. Next question is, the question is, and this is one that I answered, did you state that we need to have 2 years of professional planning before applying for the exam? And I did provide a link to that person that shows the chart of your experience versus your education versus planning accreditation school or not. There's like a really easy to read chart. And I think I included the link in the chat for everyone too, for the resource guides. It's planning.org/certification/eligible. So that's in there. Does anyone else want to add to that? I just wanted to highlight it to make sure people knew if they had that question.
I would just add that, like you said in that chart, it's 2 years if you've graduated from a master's program that's accredited. If your program is not accredited, it is 3 years. It was actually the case with me. My university was in the process of being accredited. So even if you're in the process, you're out of luck. You have to wait for 3 years. And I think if you have only an undergraduate degree, it might be closer to 4 years. And then if you have no degree, I think it's closer to 8 years. But that's all spelled out, like you said, in the guide.
And to that, then there was a question about, wait, what is this planning accreditation? And if you just Google Planning Accreditation Board, you can check to see if your school, and in some cases, I guess it's certain programs within a school may or may not be accredited. So check that too. Does anyone want to just comment any more about it? So you can go and check and see if your school or if your program is accredited by just Googling Planning Accreditation Board. Does anyone have any other comments on that? I just wanted to add it because there were a couple folks with that question. Good. Okay, next question. How much are the AICP dues and how often do we have to pay them?
I don't know the exact cost of the AICP dues, and maybe somebody else could speak to that, but those dues are due annually when your APA membership dues are due. There is the reporting cycle as far as credits is concerned is biannual, but the actual payment of those dues to be current is annual. I'm not sure if it's similar to the membership dues where they're based on salary breakdown, if that's how they're done. I know that wasn't always the case, but it's recently been switched at APA, that dues are sort of on a prorated scale for your salary.
I do believe that's the case with AICP dues still. So there isn't really an exact answer on how much you would pay. But it depends on your salary.
Okay, thank you. Next question. For the pilot program, which is the pilot program over now, or is that still a thing? It's just the AICP candidate program now, right? Okay. I guess we're not calling it a pilot anymore. It's a thing now. How many CM credits do you need to have before you take the exam?
I do not know the answer to that. I'm wondering if maybe Acela or Molly, if you know, if you are required to obtain CM credits before dropping candidate off of your AICP certification. Do you guys know the answer to that?
So after you register as to the program as an AICP candidate, you can start earning those credits, but you don't need to complete them to take the exam. You do need to complete them when you apply for certification, like after you pass the exam, after you have your 2 years of experience, after you have your essays, then you also need to have your 16 hours. And as Katrina said, it's very easy to get them even for free. So you can even have them before you take the exam, but those are not necessary at all.
And one thing I wanted to add there, if you are a student, so if you are pursuing the candidate pathway, one thing to note is that while you have that student status, I highly recommend going to the national planning conference or using your student status to get kind of reduced cost access to a bunch of different programs, because you can acquire all of those hours prior to exiting your program, graduating, and losing that kind of student moniker. So highly recommend doing that. Saves you a lot of money if you are considering doing this. And I did that. It was enormously efficient and helpful.
Thank you. Next question is, will the May and November exams offer both in-person and virtual testing options? I know the answer to that if someone else doesn't.
I do not know the answer to that.
Yeah, okay, the answer is yes. From this point forward, APA will be hosting, you can either go into your local Prometrics or you can do it online. The way that it works online now, I think just this last May was the first one that did that. It's very interesting, actually. You can do it from home or wherever you want. And they give you a list of things that you kind of have to do to prep your space, including like removing everything from view. And you have to have a camera because they'll be watching you take the exam, which is very standard for national exams that you don't take in person. It's very common. Molly, did you take the exam that way? I don't know when you took it.
Yes, actually. So Asela and I both took the exam in November. Both took it remote.
Okay.
And APA actually did some excellent work advocating for various improvements to the remote process so that you could get the functionality you would normally get at a Prometric center. Of course, just be aware that you really do need a very strong connection to sustain the exam as well as the kind of observational camera component. And it would be worth the night before doing whatever you have to do to the room where you're going to take the exam to really strip back everything. And, if I was in this room, I'd probably have to put a sheet up against this bookshelf because they're very strict on what you can and cannot have. But you could call Prometrics or use any of the online resources to know exactly what you need to do in advance, so it's not a black box process at all.
And so, yeah, so again, it will be available digitally from the comfort of your home, should you want it to be, which frankly, I would. Okay, next question. Going through here. Can you elaborate more on counting internship time for planning experience? What documentation is needed? So I guess I would say to this question to expand it to internship, volunteer, non-paid. I would even go so far as to say the non-traditional, which all of that information, again, can be found in those 3 documents that I mentioned. How to go about that and what you need to do to prove that you have the experience as a non-traditional.
I would add that you can often use internship credit, but it has to not be for coursework.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can often do that. You can use part-time work. I used my graduate student assistantship part-time, so you just obviously count it half. The guides are great. They definitely show you all of that and break it down a little bit more in detail. The other thing about the application process that I didn't mention is that they have removed the employment verification. So you no longer have to receive employment letters from your previous employers. You just need to list out your own experience. And that should also, the experience that you're listing out should be reflected in your essays. You shouldn't have an essay that is separate from what you submitted as a part of your experience.
I'd like to jump in and just say something real quick on non-traditional experience, if that's okay. Bringing it back to the story that I relayed during the counterpoints, as I relayed, my colleague had non-traditional experience as a zoning enforcement planner, and at that time it was again rejected. It was said this is not planning. So number one, we pushed back, and we wrote about it, we made it public, and I think to APA's credit, things have changed. I think the evaluations have changed. I hope, fingers crossed, that it is not that dramatically still kind of strict with gatekeeping. But that being said, if you do have non-traditional experience, just try to write about it in sort of like the mind view of a planner, right? So one of the things that my colleague did was, again, swapped out the word enforcement, which sounds too sort of law and order and use the word implementation, and it was the exact same essays, and it was able to get through. So if you do have that non-traditional experience, again, put it through the mindset, the experience, the words of planning, and you will probably have a better time getting through the screening process if you opt into this optional additional credential.
Thank you for saying that, for sure. As someone who's on a national AICP board, I was like, oh, that is not the case anymore. And in fact, they APA is really good now, and perhaps it was because of some of the work that you put into it. You know, they encourage non-traditional planners to apply, or part-time planners, I guess, to apply. You know, it's all about your essays. It's, you know, can you craft can you craft the experience in such a way that it meets the requirements. Caitlin, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, just reinforcing Jonathan's point. Molly had brought it up in her presentation about, you know, asking your PDO, or maybe it was Katrina, asking your PDO to review essays or have another planner review those essays. I think that that resource is very valuable, especially for a planner in the non-traditional sense. To utilize those resources if they choose to move forward with the certification process, because planners would look at those essays through that lens and may be able to provide, you know, critical insight for how to better convey the work that you do and how it translate in a planning sense to better support your case for seeking certification.
And the other thing I'll add too is if you complete your essays in kind of that early bird window, and the essays, I guess, for lack of a less strong word, I guess, rejected, they list what it was that you did or said that didn't meet the requirements. So then you have the ability to rewrite your essays and submit it within the same time period. So you're not losing a whole exam period. So that's, in one case, it's, I guess, good to be the early bird in that case if you're concerned about that.
As a former PDO, I will say that don't be shy to ask us to review your, or I mean, anybody on your board or mentor you might have, anybody that you think would be good for that. I had a colleague reach out a couple of months ago asking for my review. It doesn't take long, and most people don't mind at all.
Okay, so lots of questions coming in on how much did you study? How much time should I be setting aside? And I think, I bet we're gonna get some really polar opposites, just depending on your personality type, or, you know, how far in advance should I start this process? So hit me with it. Tell me how much time you spent. Be real, don't lie.
I'll go first. I took the exam in November of 2017, so the exam was in a bit of a different format at that time. I started studying, so it was a November cycle. I started studying in July, and I spent a week, and I would go over one section at a time, and I broke everything out by section. There was 5 categories that were mentioned during the program. So I took those 5 categories and I broke them out into a week-by-week study program. I am not a great test taker. That's something that I know about myself. I have test anxiety. It's just something I'm not very good at. So I really wanted to make sure that I spent a lot of time studying the material, knowing the material, so that when I got into the test situation, that my day of anxiety didn't override the knowledge that I had in order to perform well. I passed the exam by 1 point. So it's not like I really did an excellent job taking the test, but I did well enough to pass. And
pass.
Yeah, passing is passing, okay? It doesn't matter how many points you get as long as you do it. And it's okay if it takes you a couple of times, because like Jonathan had mentioned, New Jersey has a separate licensure program. I'm from New Jersey. I have the separate New Jersey state licensure. I had to sit for that exam 3 times. And that stinks, failing a test. It's like not fun. But I studied super, super hard, and it was easier for me to lay out a program because I was working full time. So laying out that program and dedicating time every week to learning a new section and then taking a test on it was helpful for me personally.
I can add my experience in. I took the exam in November 2019. I probably studied for about 3 months. I went along with Henry Bittaker's course, which the information is in the slides. He does a fabulous job of breaking it down by weekly lecture. And again, that's totally free. So I went along with each of his weekly lectures. And at the time when we were all still in offices, I walk and bike to work. And so I ended up, most of the time when I would walk, I downloaded his lectures onto my phone and I listened to them 30 minutes, about a 30-minute walk, 30 minutes in the morning, 30 minutes in the evening. So I did that during the week. During my lunch break, I would do practice questions. I then on the weekends would take maybe a Saturday and go more in depth into the materials that he had provided as supplemental. And I would maybe do another practice exam on the weekend. The big thing, and I think this was mentioned in the presentation already, for me was figuring out where my weak areas were. So I never took a planning law course. It wasn't required as a part of my master's program. And so I was pretty weak in law. So I had to do a lot of case studies on that. So once you figure out, hey, I know this is probably going to be on the exam and I'm not very good at it. For example, floor area ratio, always on the exam. You need to know how to calculate that. So if you know you're not good at that, just find some practice questions on that, find some materials, study that. Henry also offers these great past test taker comments. So things that people found coming up on the exam that are really good to review. Because he does the course every exam cycle, he updates that. So you can kind of look through those resources and say, hey, I'm seeing that this is coming up and I'm not very, good at that, or I need to study that. So I know it definitely varies, but for me, it was about 3 months of pretty intense studying.
I graduated from my master's program at the beginning of September, and I started studying mid in September to take exam mid-November. So it will be around 2 months maybe. And I had the advantage that I was already like in the rhythm of being studying like all the time. So it was just like switching topics in a way. And yeah, the way I divided that was by the 5 areas, and I tried to like focus on one area every week. And at the end of the week, I will take a practice test, like trying to recreate real conditions, like the 3.5 hours, like a whole test, no interruptions, no eating, like all of that. And then at the end, like I will make an analysis of where are my weak areas, and then I will try to focus on that the next week, or like at the end when I try to make like the whole review of where my weak areas are. And with my weak areas, I will try to read books besides the course that I was taking, like read books or go deeper into those topics. I completely loved the quick notes, the ones you can find in APA, because you can understand like what the topic is about and what is APA's position in that policy, which is basically what the exam is about. So that was basically it, like just passing from one rhythm of study to other and just doing that. So 2 intense months of studying, maybe not so much. They recommend that you study around 80 or 100 hours for the test. Honestly, I will be surprised if I did more than 40. Like I used the bare minimum. Like this, I know these are my weak areas. That was it.
This has been an appropriate sharing session actually, because I came in at 1.5 months. But a couple caveats there. So, okay, I was in a sales program, so I had just graduated from a master's program that actually did have a really robust administrative law component. So there was a whole bunch of the content that had been packed into my mind. I had just finished a thesis that touched on a bunch of topic areas that were addressed in the exam. I worked for the City of Seattle's Department Review Team, or Development Review Team, excuse me, which took care of some of the kind of the standard points of practice when it comes to, considering variances and that type of thing. And I have a background in science and biology. So when it came to kind of blitzing through some of the environmental planning side or climate change side, there was a kind of a background knowledge to draw from. But in terms of making this actually applicable to everyone, because I think it is, the biggest thing is, right, knowing yourself and how you study and what gets information into your head. And so what I did, kind of similar to Caitlin, is I basically spent a week of that time building a tracker where I went on the APA website and found those policy guides and the quick guides and a number of other resources, and actually just made a whole list of here's the stuff I have to cover. Absolutely. Content from the course, did the same thing, ported it in there, and then found a couple external resources as well as 3 textbooks, and wrote it all out and made kind of a comparison tracker. So I knew I have this much time, and on a day-to-day basis, I can figure out how far I've moved through the material relative to how far I've moved through that study period. I do think the critical things I did were reading textbooks that had a combination of kind of narrative content and discrete content. So if you get a textbook, again, on ethics and scenarios, you're going to be asked a bunch of questions. It's nice to have a way to deal with that material that isn't just in your own head, but actually using real scenarios. I used a contemporary planning textbook, which was offered a nice kind of narrative description of the history and theory of planning as it's changed over time, and some considerations for, you know, what has worked and what hasn't. So that's kind of one form of getting it in. But also looking at another textbook that goes through just kind of standards of planning practice, you know, moving through that and looking at the myriad ways we engage with the public, or different types of very technical specifications you might use in transportation planning and not another field. If you kind of build out modules for yourself, you will probably recognize a lot of the content. And so what you're really doing is kind of triaging and saying, okay, interesting. What I've read today really resonates with my understanding of practice. Great. So I can kind of review that once more, but I don't need to kind of reassess what my intuitive response to a question is going to be. Identifying what doesn't jive with how you understand things to be, or what your day-to-day practice is, that's going to be a big flag for you. And you might want to highlight that and say, okay, this is something I have to come back to, because I'm actually going to have to study something that runs a little bit counter to what I might intuitively do on a day-to-day basis. So kind of breaking stuff down and knowing that that's, at the end of the day, the crux of what you're going to have to do to address the exam is really helpful, I think. But yeah, it was a blitz, and I was in between jobs, so definitely had more time to give to this than someone juggling a job plus life plus other things. So definitely own that.
Thank you. Let's move then a little bit into those folks that have been out of school for a while, and even those who haven't, like Caitlin mentioned, and I fall in that bucket too, of just not having, you know, just having test anxiety. I took it in 2015, and that was before the candidate pilot program. So I was out of school for a little while myself, and you know, it's a little intimidating thinking about sitting there taking an exam for 3 or 4 hours. Literally, it's the longest exam I had ever taken. And it can be really intimidating, particularly if you've been either out of school for a long time, or you just have test anxiety, or let's say that you have something that's going against you, like you have ADD or dyslexia or something along those lines. If we could talk a little bit about that. And as on a side note, I have some members at APA Ohio that have reached out to me before that have said, you know, I'm dyslexic, or I have ADD, or I have severe anxiety. What can I do to take this test, or have an alternative, or, you know, whatever that might be. And there are some options. I don't think that they are entirely helpful. So at least personally for us here in Ohio, I'm looking at ways in which to have test alternatives for those folks that just really cannot sit in front of a computer, or even, you know, in front of a piece of paper and take an exam, so that they too can be AICP certified. So if anyone has any ideas or has a passion for that, please reach out to me, because I'm trying to figure that out. But first, so this is sort of a two-prong question. Let's take the latter first. Accommodations that APA makes for those that need them. Does anyone want to discuss that?
I don't know exactly what those accommodations are. Christine, do you know?
Yeah. I just didn't want to take over.
No,
Please
impart your wisdom.
Yes, you can receive additional time if you need it. Someone can read the questions to you. There is an option for paper. You can be in a space by yourself if you need to be. And that's pretty much the general, I guess, accommodation across the testing board, not just with APA, but across the board in other professions as well. So that is that. So if you need that additional assistance, that is what is available to you. Now, if we could talk a little bit about, I guess, the test itself, and for those that might have some anxiety about sitting down and taking a multiple choice test for 3 or 4 hours, either with strangers next to them or at least in the comfort of their home. If you have any tips and tricks to kind of get through that and sort of get those, get that kind of stuff taken care of. Anyone have any advice?
I can add a little bit there. I'm not necessarily a bad test taker. I never really got that much anxiety over like a multiple choice test, but I know that I went into it with the mindset of I'd been out of school for a couple of years, and I really had to switch my mindset back to, okay, I'm a student again. I'm relearning some of these things. Some things I have a pretty good handle on, but some of them I'm having to think about. So really setting that schedule for myself, and pressing on those weak areas, and really thinking to myself, like, this is a time frame where I am a student again, and this is how I am approaching this. That helped me. I also know that for some folks, that if you aren't a good test taker and multiple choice is difficult for you, you may have to tack on a couple more months of studying just to get that anxiety out. But I'm sure Kate has maybe something to add to that.
I would just say that taking practice exams really helped, and like everybody has said before, really putting out that schedule for yourself to recreate test conditions, for like day of test conditions, was extremely helpful for me personally. And then during the exam, some of the things that aren't available when you're recreating is the marking exam questions. If you're taking the test on the computer, the ability to mark questions and go back to them if you don't know the answer, just to make better use of your time. Don't spend 5 minutes agonizing over one question. Read it, mark it, move on to the next one, ones that you can confidently answer, and then go back and take time to focus on questions that you're really struggling with or having to think about more intensely. That really helped me just from a time management perspective, because I took almost the whole 3.5 hours, like really reading the questions. It took me a long time. And that was just part of that performance anxiety portion of it. I just really wanted to make sure that I was doing the test the way that I needed to in order to pass. And I really felt that using that marking feature 100% helped my ability to manage the exam in an appropriate fashion.
One or two other things, just reiterating that the biggest thing is, removing surprise. I'm someone who used to have a great deal of test anxiety, primarily around time and the thought that I would run out. So again, just reiterating, the more you can see question examples and from multiple sources, the better I think you'll be to actually be, you'll do if you're sitting in an exam, seeing a slightly different worded question, right? If you rely on a single source for that type of stuff and the exam changes, either the answer options or the wording might be different, and that could be very unsettling. So just get a lot of exposure to a lot of different material. The other thing is actually for someone who has maybe time anxiety, there are some passage questions. One tip is to actually read the answers, skim the answers before you read the passage, because it means that when you read the passage, you can triage your analysis of it, knowing what your target is, right? And so you can actually do that with a lot of different types of questions, just to keep focusing on You aren't supposed to memorize the passage or even the entire exam, right? Your goal is to hit a question and move on, appreciating that, again, 20 of those questions don't even count for your score. The last thing I'll say is this remote test option might actually be good for someone who has a lot of test anxiety, assuming you have an environment that you can kind of control with really good internet access. The reason being that I think, like a lot of us have experienced in work settings, you know, if you're sitting at your home and you're looking at your computer, you're basically taking a practice exam, only this time it's not for practice, right? But otherwise, all the other conditions are the same for you. And that's very different from going into a test center where you're given all the external cues that tell you, hey, something really big is happening here. So just take that into account and consider that that might really work well for you. But you don't get paper, scratch paper. So, you know, way to.
Thank you.
I wanted to take a quick note on reasonable accommodations. I just wanted to say, number one, I'm really glad that APA is allowing reasonable accommodations. I've seen the positive results and the benefits of that in, you know, the academic spaces that I work in with students, and also in the working environment where sometimes reasonable accommodations are built into your local municipal code or the zoning code and the personnel processes, right? What I'd like to just uplift for everybody here, if you do opt into taking AICP and you have issues where you need reasonable accommodations, advocate for yourself. It's there, use it. If you need it, speak up, use your voice, right? As planners, we need to use our voice. Advocate for yourself. You are your first and most dedicated advocate. Don't be hesitant, because that might make the difference between you passing or not passing this exam. So please advocate for yourself if you need those reasonable accommodations for AICP testing.
Okay, we have hit 2:30. We have to stop. There's still so many great questions. Folks, feel free to reach out to these presenters with your final questions if we didn't get to them. There were a lot of specific questions. You can also reach out directly to AICP. I think it's AICPexam@planning.org. Or, you know, and if you don't hear back from them, because sometimes I know sometimes you don't hear back from them, contact your chapter, your PDO, because they know people, or contact me, I'll help you. So be sure to do that. We are recording the session. We'll have it up on our YouTube channel. We'll have a PDF copy of this on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Any final thoughts? Any hoorahs?
Just one final sign off for me. I just want to thank everybody for spending the time today. Thank the panelists for providing, you know, a wealth of information about the exam and continuing to uplift folks who may not want to take the exam. I think it's all really important and part of a larger conversation about professionalism and what we do as a profession. So I just want to thank everybody for their time. And just a shameless plug for Women in Planning, you can find us at women.planning.org. And if you have specific questions, I didn't provide our contact information as part of the presentation, please email me. My email is katewintz1@gmail.com, KATEWINTZ1 like the number @gmail.com. So y'all can reach out to me and I can connect you to anybody on the panel today. And again, thanks so much for joining us and have a wonderful Friday.